We live in a psychological era that glorifies awareness, where naming emotions has become a badge of intelligence. Yet beneath this sophistication lies a quiet crisis. Our capacity to understand feelings has outpaced our willingness to experience them. Modern consciousness operates like an overactive observer, dissecting emotions into concepts while remaining untouched by their reality. Evolutionarily, this makes sense. Our brains evolved to avoid pain, not to process it. But what began as survival has become paralysis. We don't lack emotional awareness. We fear what awareness will awaken. This is the paradox we'll unfold from knowing about emotion to being with it. Part 1. When awareness becomes a performance. In today's culture, emotional awareness has evolved into something performative, an aesthetic, a brand, even a form of social currency. We use psychological vocabulary like armor, not to connect, but to curate an image of intelligence and depth. You hear it everywhere. I'm anxious because of my attachment style. He's projecting his trauma. I'm setting boundaries for my nervous system. These phrases once represented insight. Now they often serve as emotional camouflage, linguistic sophistication that keeps us safely distanced from what we actually feel. This shift reflects a deeper psychological irony. Our collective obsession with awareness has not made us more emotionally present. It has made us better at performing presence. Social media platforms have amplified this phenomenon. What was once a private journey inward has been externalized, transformed into digestible content, and self-help snippets optimized for validation. The Instagram therapy culture rewards language over transformation, reflection over vulnerability. We no longer process emotion. We post about it. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. The human brain is wired to seek safety through belonging. In ancestral environments, displaying social attunement increased survival. Today, emotional fluency signals social intelligence, and social intelligence gains status. But beneath that evolutionary strategy lies an emotional detachment, the subtle belief that awareness alone equals growth. We've confused understanding emotion with integrating it, mistaking the performance of reflection for the practice of connection. Psychologically, this behavior maps onto a defense mechanism called intellectualization. It's the act of analyzing emotions to avoid feeling them. When we say, "I understand why I'm hurt," we momentarily relieve the discomfort without ever sitting inside it. The intellect becomes a barrier, creating what psychoanalyst Carl Jung might call a sterile awareness clarity without aliveness. We know the topography of our pain, yet we remain tourists in it. This intellectual distance isn't malicious, it's adaptive. For many, analysis offers safety in a world that punishes vulnerability. Our nervous systems are conditioned to believe that feeling deeply is dangerous, too emotional, too dramatic, too much. So we translate emotion into intellect. We create the illusion of control through language. We call it awareness, but it's often avoidance in disguise. Consider the modern healing industry courses on shadow work, trauma workshops, mindfulness challenges, all promising transformation through understanding. But understanding isn't transformation. Knowing your patterns doesn't dissolve them. Feeling does. The irony is that the more we talk about healing, the less we seem to experience it. Awareness has become a performance loop, constantly describing, rarely dissolving. This performance of awareness also reflects a cultural anxiety about emotional messiness. Society prizes coherence and confidence. Raw emotion feels inconvenient. To appear emotionally regulated is to appear evolved. So we curate self-awareness as identity. We claim to know ourselves while carefully maintaining the version of self that seems most stable, most enlightened, most acceptable. Yet the deeper truth is that real awareness, raw, unfiltered humbling, is often chaotic. It dismantles the self we're trying to preserve. Here lies the paradox of modern consciousness. We are more emotionally literate than any generation before us, yet less emotionally intimate with ourselves. We can identify our triggers but struggle to surrender to them. We can name every psychological framework but resist their embodied experience. Awareness has become a mirror, flawless, polished, but cold to the touch. True emotional awareness is not about performing understanding. It's about enduring contact. It's the courage to let language fall away and meet the feeling that defies it. Because beneath every explanation, beneath every clever insight, there's a quieter truth waiting to be felt. We don't lack awareness, we hide behind it. Part 2. How we outsmart the feelings we fear. There's a subtle genius in the human mind. When something hurts, we don't just avoid it, we outthink it. We use language, logic, and analysis as a form of emotional armor. It feels productive, intelligent, even healing. But beneath the surface, this mental agility is often a disguise, a way to escape vulnerability, while convincing ourselves we're confronting it. Psychology calls this mechanism intellectualization. It's the process of turning emotions into concepts, converting pain into patterns, and transforming vulnerability into vocabulary. It's why someone might say I'm feeling this way because of my attachment style, rather than I'm lonely. One sounds insightful, the other feels raw. The first protects our self-image. The second exposes it. Our brains evolved to prioritize safety over truth. In the ancestral environment, emotional regulation meant survival. Panic could attract predators. Grief could slow the tribe. Rage could fracture unity. Over millennia, our nervous systems learned to suppress emotion for the sake of coherence. Today, that same wiring manifests not through silence, but through analysis. We've upgraded repression into intellectual sophistication. Instead of saying, I'm scared, we dissect fear. Instead of crying, we write about the biology of crying. The intellect becomes the modern shield of the emotionally civilized. But this sophistication has a cost. When we analyze emotions without experiencing them, we fragment ourselves. The mind tries to lead where the body refuses to follow. The nervous system remains charged, unprocessed, waiting. This creates the quiet dissonance so many people feel today. They can explain their emotions perfectly, but still feel trapped inside them. It's emotional fluency without freedom. Take a simple example. You sit down to journal about sadness. You list reasons, you find root causes, you trace it to childhood patterns, unmet needs, maybe even past relationships. You reach a profound insight, and yet nothing changes. The sadness lingers almost indifferent to your understanding. Because emotion doesn't dissolve through logic, It dissolves through contact. You don't need a breakthrough. You need to feel the breakdown. This is where modern self-development often fails us. We treat emotion like a malfunction to be solved rather than an experience to be metabolized. Fixing emotions has become the new form of control. We ask, how can I stop feeling anxious, instead of, what is this anxiety asking of me? We rush to regulate, optimize, and transcend emotions, never realizing that the very act of control is what keeps us disconnected from their intelligence. From a Stoic lens, this confusion is ancient. The Stoics never taught emotional suppression. They taught emotional acceptance through understanding. Marcus Aurelius didn't avoid his grief. He observed it until he saw its impermanence. Awareness to the Stoic mind was not an escape from feeling, but a doorway into truth. The modern distortion of Stoicism, calm as numbness, detachment as avoidance, is itself a symptom of our collective fear of vulnerability. To outsmart emotion is to believe we can master life without being touched by it. But every emotion we evade eventually finds another way to speak through the body, through fatigue, through isolation, through the quiet sense that we're living half present. Emotional resistance doesn't vanish, it recycles. The deeper truth is that we don't fear emotion itself. We fear what emotion changes the identities. It dissolves the control, it threatens the truths it reveals. Feeling sadness means confronting loss. Feeling anger means acknowledging unmet needs. Feeling love means risking rejection. To fully feel is to risk transformation. And transformation for the ego feels like death. So we outthink it. We rationalize pain into patterns and call it insight. But healing doesn't happen when the mind wins, it happens when the heart is finally allowed to lose. Because our fear isn't emotion, it's what emotion might awaken. Part 3: Why feeling safe once meant staying numb. To understand why we fear emotions, we must go back to the first environment that taught us how to feel: childhood. For most of us, our early emotional education was not about understanding, but suppression. The lessons came subtly through tone, posture, silence. Don't cry. Be strong. Good kids don't get angry. We learned that emotional expression was unsafe, not because our parents were cruel, but because they were scared too. Generations passed down this quiet inheritance, the belief that emotional containment equals emotional maturity. In psychological terms, this is called emotional conditioning, the implicit learning that certain emotions lead to rejection, shame, or punishment. A child doesn't need to be told explicitly to hide their feelings. The nervous system adapts instantly. A sigh from a parent, a cold shoulder, an unmet need. Over time, the brain associates vulnerability with danger. The body learns a simple rule: feeling is unsafe. From an evolutionary perspective, this adaptation makes sense. The child's survival depends entirely on belonging. Being too much emotionally risks disconnection, and disconnection to a child's brain equals death. So the child learns to disconnect from themselves instead. They develop what trauma specialists call protective numbness, a biological mechanism that blunts emotional intensity to preserve attachment. The body tightens, the breath shallows. The heart rate stabilizes not out of calmness but defense. The adult inherits this armor unknowingly. Years later, they might feel inexplicably distant from their emotions. They describe themselves as logical calm or unbothered, but beneath that composure lives a nervous system frozen in survival mode. They may struggle to cry even when something deeply hurts. They may crave connection, but feel overwhelmed by intimacy. This is not emotional weakness, it's emotional memory. The body remembers the rules it learned long before the mind could question them. Every act of emotional repression once served a purpose. It kept you safe in an environment that couldn't hold your truth. When you were told to stop crying, your nervous system didn't interpret it as advice, it registered a threat. It concluded that showing emotion jeopardized your bond, your worth, your belonging. So it adapted. It buried tears beneath reason, joy beneath politeness, anger beneath compliance. What we call emotional avoidance in adulthood is often the continuation of that same strategy, the body's last line of defense against exile. But what begins as protection eventually becomes prison. The very mechanisms that once preserved our safety begin to suffocate our aliveness. We stop crying, and slowly we stop feeling. We stop feeling, and slowly we stop connecting. We call it stability, but it's often dissociation wearing a calm face. Modern neuroscience supports this. Research on emotional suppression shows that avoiding emotions doesn't erase them, it stores them in the body's implicit memory. The amygdala. The brain's alarm system remains active even when consciousness denies the signal. The result is tension anxiety, chronic fatigue symptoms of emotions trapped in the nervous system without expression. This is why people who appear emotionally strong often carry unexplained exhaustion. Their strength is endurance, not freedom. Healing, then, isn't about tearing down this armor overnight. It's about teaching the body that safety no longer requires silence. It's the gentle reintroduction of emotion as ally, not adversary. The process is paradoxical. You must feel the fear of feeling before you can feel freely. But every tear tremor or breath of vulnerability signals a deeper truth, that you are no longer that child trying to earn permission to exist. The moment you realize your numbness was once intelligence, compassion replaces shame. You stop judging your distance and begin understanding its origin. And from that understanding, something profound begins to shift the body. That once froze to survive slowly thaws to live. Because healing truly begins the moment safety no longer means silence. Part 4. The Happiness Trap. Why positivity makes us numb. Somewhere along the timeline of modern psychology, happiness stopped being a feeling and became a performance. We learned to curate it, display it, and measure it until the absence of happiness felt like failure. The result is a culture addicted to emotional brightness, where sadness is treated like a disease and silence like a glitch in the system. The mantra of our age is simple: stay positive. But beneath that well-intentioned optimism lies one of the most pervasive psychological traps of our time. Toxic positivity. The insistence on maintaining happiness regardless of circumstance is not emotional mastery. It's emotional repression disguised as strength. We scroll through endless affirmations, gratitude lists, and good vibes only slogans, not realizing that this constant demand for light is what deepens the shadow within. The pressure to remain calm and cheerful doesn't heal us. It teaches us to hide. We start to believe that being okay is proof of worth, and anything less is weakness. This cultural conditioning has roots in evolutionary psychology. Human beings are social animals designed to maintain cohesion within the tribe. Positive emotions once signaled safety. Smiles meant acceptance, laughter meant belonging. But in the modern social environment, this ancient mechanism has been hijacked. Social media amplifies it, rewarding emotional polish over authenticity. The evolutionary drive to be liked now merges with a psychological fear of rejection. And so, instead of expressing emotions honestly, we self-regulate to fit the algorithm of approval. Work culture mirrors this dynamic. Productivity has replaced presence as the modern virtue. Emotional neutrality is rewarded, especially in professional spaces where composure equals competence. People don't say "I'm overwhelmed," they say "I'm managing." They don't admit burnout. They call it high performance. The suppression becomes institutional, embedded in the language of success. What looks like self-control is often self-abandonment, an emotional dissociation repackaged as ambition. Neuroscience reveals that suppression carries a physiological cost. When we chronically suppress emotion, the amygdala remains activated while the prefrontal cortex attempts to override it. This dissonance produces a quiet exhaustion, an ongoing battle between what the body feels and what the mind demands. Over time, this disconnect manifests as anxiety apathy, or the strange emotional flatness many describe as feeling nothing. We think we're balanced, but we're actually numb. This numbness has become so normalized that many mistake it for peace. We've redefined serenity as the absence of disturbance rather than the presence of truth. But as Marcus Aurelius wrote, tranquility is the order of the soul. Order doesn't come from avoidance, it comes from alignment. The Stoics understood what our culture often forgets. Peace is not found in fleeing emotion, but in understanding it. To reject sadness is to reject the wisdom it carries. To deny anger is to deny the boundary it signals. If we examine the psychology of chronic positivity, we find fear at its root. Fear of loss, of vulnerability, of being perceived as broken. The compulsion to stay positive isn't about joy. It's about control. It's the ego's attempt to domesticate chaos. But life is not a static state of calm. It's a continuum of emotional weather. Suppressing storms doesn't stop them. It only ensures we never learn to dance in the rain. Authenticity then becomes the true act of courage. To feel without justification, to grieve without apology, to express without fear of appearing unhealed. This is emotional integrity. When we begin to honor the full spectrum of our inner life, we discover a deeper kind of happiness, one that isn't fragile because it's built on truth. The happiness trap isn't that we chase joy, it's that we chase only joy. Real peace doesn't come from constant positivity, but from emotional honesty. And the moment we stop performing happiness, we make space for something far more enduring serenity rooted in reality. Because in the end, we were never meant to silence our storms, we were meant to learn from their thunder. We've mistaken suppression for serenity, when in truth, serenity begins where suppression ends. Part 5. Courage, the emotion you've been avoiding the most of all the emotions we discuss. Courage is perhaps the most misunderstood. We tend to see it as the opposite of fear, a heroic quality that rises in moments of crisis. But in truth, courage is not the absence of fear. It's the willingness to stay present within it. It's the quiet capacity to face what the nervous system wants to flee, to remain conscious in the places where the body wants to shut down. And when it comes to emotional life, this kind of courage is the bridge between awareness and healing. You can understand your triggers, your childhood patterns, your attachment style, but none of that matters if you don't have the courage to feel what those insights reveal. Awareness without courage is like reading about swimming while drowning. You might know every technique, every theory of breath control, but knowledge doesn't keep you afloat. Contact does. Movement does. The willingness to touch the water does. In Jungian psychology, this descent from intellect into emotion is known as integration. It's the process of reconciling the conscious and unconscious, bringing light to the places you've avoided. But that descent is rarely comfortable. It requires you to step into the raw immediacy of your own experience, stripped of labels and analysis. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That darkness isn't external, it's the unprocessed grief, the fear of rejection, the anger you were never allowed to express. And courage is the muscle that lets you face them without running. The Stoics too understood this paradox. They spoke of apatheia, not emotional numbness, but mastery over reaction through understanding. Marcus Aurelius did not seek to eliminate emotion. He sought to remain unmoved by its distortion. He wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." Emotional courage, then, is the practice of staying long enough with your emotion to see its true size, often smaller than your imagination painted it. Practically emotional courage begins in micro-moments. The moment you pause before dismissing sadness with, "I'm fine." The moment you admit that your irritation hides hurt. The moment you whisper, "I'm scared," even when no one is there to hear it. These are not grand gestures. They are quiet acts of psychological rebellion against the mind's instinct to escape. Each time you choose to stay, your nervous system learns that emotion is not fatal. A simple model can help anchor this practice. Notice, name, allow. Integrate. Notice, observe the emotion as it arises in real time before the story forms. Name. Label it precisely. Don't say "I'm stressed." Say "I'm afraid I'll fail." "I'm lonely." "I'm ashamed." Naming disarms the vagueness that fuels fear. Allow, let the sensation exist without rushing to fix it. The body's language is discomfort. Let it speak. Integrate. Ask what the emotion reveals about your values, needs, or truth. Then act from that understanding, not from reactivity. Modern neuroscience validates this ancient wisdom. When we face emotion consciously, we activate the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reflection, and self-regulation while reducing amygdala overdrive. Courage literally rewires the nervous system. It transforms the physiology of avoidance into the biology of resilience. But emotional courage is not glamorous. It doesn't always look strong. Often it looks like tears, trembling, or silence. It's the courage to be human in a culture obsessed with composure. It's the willingness to surrender control, to feel the fear that has lived beneath your intellect for years and not let it define you. Because the truth is, fear never really leaves. But when you stop resisting it, it loses its tyranny. You begin to see that courage isn't a state you achieve, it's a practice you live. And the moment you stop trying to conquer your emotions and start standing beside them, something extraordinary happens. Fear becomes information, pain becomes guidance, and vulnerability becomes power. Emotional courage is the quiet revolution of self-awareness, the shift from knowing your emotions to trusting them. It is the place where awareness becomes aliveness, and where healing finally begins. Part 6: How to Stay When You Want to Escape. The real work of emotional awareness doesn't happen in grand moments of insight. It happens in quiet, ordinary moments when everything in you wants to leave. The instinct to escape, whether through distraction, analysis, or control, isn't failure. It's biology. Your nervous system is wired to move away from discomfort. To stay requires a conscious act of evolution. Emotional regulation at its core is not about suppressing emotion, but staying present long enough for the nervous system to realize that feeling is not fatal. Every time you resist this impulse to flee, you teach your body a new kind of safety, one that doesn't depend on external calm, but internal coherence. To begin, you don't need elaborate rituals or spiritual theatrics. You need micro moments of courage, simple, repeatable gestures that bring you back to yourself when your instinct is to run. The micro pause. The first practice is deceptively simple pause. Before reacting, before explaining, before reaching for the phone, pause. The space between stimulus and response is where awareness begins. In that second of stillness, the body's automatic defenses lose their momentum. Neuroscience calls this response, inhibition, a micro-interruption that allows the prefrontal cortex to override the amygdala's fear response. In practical terms, this is the moment you remember you have a choice. Try this after a triggering email, a tense conversation, or an unexpected silence. Inhale slowly. Feel the space expand between what happened and what you want to do. You don't need to fix the emotion, just witness it. Every pause is a small act of reclamation. 2. Somatic anchoring. Most people think of emotions as thoughts, but they are primarily sensations. Fear tightens the chest, grief constricts the throat, anger burns in the solar plexus. The mind's stories are secondary echoes of the body's alarm. Somatic anchoring brings awareness back to where the emotion actually lives inside the body. When discomfort arises, close your eyes and locate it. Don't describe it, feel it. Notice its temperature, its movement, its edges. Breathe into that exact space without trying to push it away. What you're doing here is reactivating the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's natural mechanism for restoration. This is emotional digestion, letting the body process what the mind can't. Name and stay. Labeling emotions activates the left hemisphere of the brain, reducing the intensity of the right hemisphere's emotional flood. Psychologists call it affect labeling. The practice is simple: name what you feel, then stay with it 1 minute longer than you want to. I'm angry. I'm ashamed. I'm afraid. Stay. Breathe. Let the feeling exist without story or justification. The emotion might intensify briefly, but that's not escalation. It's release. Emotional energy, once acknowledged, often dissipates naturally. What we call emotional stuckness is often unexpressed honesty, trapped behind avoidance. Reconnecting with daily life. These practices are not meant to live in therapy rooms or meditation retreats. They belong in the everyday moments where awareness is tested. The commute home after a draining day, the silence before sleep, the pause after someone's indifference. In those moments, staying means softening the compulsive need to self-improve and simply noticing your humanity. You might discover that most of your pain doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be felt. You'll realize that the body's trembling is not weakness, that tears are a pressure valve, that anxiety often masks a need for rest, not perfection. Healing begins when discomfort is no longer mistaken for danger, and when the urge to escape becomes an invitation to reconnect. The transformative insight. Staying doesn't make the emotion disappear. It integrates it. You begin to sense that beneath the turbulence, there's a current of stability untouched by circumstance. That stability is presence, the part of you that observes without judgment, endures without resistance, and transforms without force. This is the paradox of true healing. It's not about feeling better, it's about feeling fully. The goal is not to eliminate pain, but to expand your capacity to hold it without breaking. Because when you learn to stay, especially when you most want to escape, you stop negotiating with your emotions and start befriending them. And that, quietly and profoundly, is where freedom begins. Part 7. The moment awareness becomes aliveness. There comes a quiet point in every inner journey when awareness stops being something we do and becomes something we are. After all the observation, the reflection, the courage to stay, something subtle begins to shift. The war with emotion dissolves. Fear no longer feels like a failure. Sadness no longer feels like regression. You begin to sense that your emotions were never trying to destroy you. They were trying to guide you home. This is the moment when awareness becomes aliveness. When understanding ceases to be intellectual and turns cellular, lived through the body, breathed through the heart. It's the transition from controlling life to participating in it. From that space, emotion no longer appears as chaos to manage, but as information to integrate. Every feeling becomes a messenger carrying precise data about your unmet needs, forgotten desires, or unlived truths. From a psychological perspective, this marks the end of dissociation and the beginning of integration. The prefrontal cortex and limbic system, once at odds, begin to synchronize. Awareness and emotion move in harmony instead of competition. The nervous system recalibrates not toward constant calm, but toward coherence, the ability to move through life's emotional spectrum without fragmentation. This is what modern neuroscience calls emotional flexibility, and what ancient philosophy called tranquility. Stoic wisdom foresaw this state centuries ago. Marcus Aurelius spoke not of suppressing pain, but of allowing it to coexist with peace. Accept whatever comes to you woven in the pattern of your destiny for what could more aptly fit your needs, to the Stoic mind. Serenity was not an escape from disturbance. It was the mastery of coexistence. Emotional awareness matures into this understanding. Peace is not fragile because it includes everything, even the storm. In this maturity, relationships transform too. When emotion is no longer feared, connection becomes honest. You stop projecting unprocessed pain onto others. You no longer demand that people soothe what you haven't yet faced within yourself. Intimacy becomes less about merging and more about witnessing, allowing two emotional worlds to meet without collision. Real connection paradoxically grows from emotional independence. There's also a deep shift in how you experience meaning. Awareness reveals that your emotions were never obstacles to enlightenment. They were invitations to presence. Each wave of sadness, joy, frustration, or tenderness becomes a sensory proof of existence. You begin to see the beauty in impermanence, the sacredness in imperfection. The mind stops dividing experience into good or bad. It simply sees what is. This is the essence of aliveness, not a constant high, but a steady intimacy with reality. You notice the breeze against your skin, the texture of silence, the warmth behind your ribs when gratitude arrives uninvited. The ordinary becomes luminous because you are no longer split from it. You've moved from observing life to inhabiting it. And yet this state isn't permanent, it's cyclical. Awareness is not a finish line, it's a rhythm. You'll still drift, still forget, still fall back into old patterns. But each return will be softer. You'll stop punishing yourself for forgetting and start trusting the remembering. Because every descent into emotion now carries the memory of your own capacity to emerge. Perhaps this is what all psychological and spiritual traditions point toward. Not perfection, but participation. Not transcendence, but intimacy with existence itself. When awareness deepens into aliveness, we realize that being human was never a problem to solve. It was the very path to awakening. So as this journey closes, return to simplicity. Ask yourself, what emotion have I been avoiding today? Don't analyze it. Don't rush to fix it. Just sit with it. One breath, one heartbeat, one honest moment. Because in that stillness, you'll remember we were never meant to escape emotion. We were meant to evolve through it. Outro the small act of courage. We don't lack emotional awareness. We fear the truth it reveals. In a world obsessed with control and constant improvement, the most radical act is to simply feel. Tonight, when the noise fades and the distractions lose their pull, sit quietly and ask yourself, what emotion have I been running from? Don't analyze it. Don't fix it. Just allow it to exist. True awareness doesn't guide you around pain, it guides you through it. Every feeling you face with gentleness becomes part of your wholeness. And perhaps that's what courage truly is, not conquering emotion, but meeting it without retreat. If this message resonated with you, save or share it with someone who's been trying too hard to stay positive. Subscribe to Depth Psychology today for more reflections like this, because awareness like healing grows when it's shared.